Think we'll be starting pretty soon, maybe just one more minute in case people are running late and to let people in the waiting room in. Um, of course.
All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this academic session of Gender Theory is for Everyone, or the Social Reproduction Theory Lab, sponsored by the generous support of Purdue University's Department of History. I am very, very pleased at our full lineup of speakers. More on that later. But if you've seen the poster, you will know that we have many treats in store, including today's wonderful presentation. Um, I would like to thank Dr. Susan Ferguson and Dr. Erin Jaffe for being my co-conspirators on this project, which would not have been possible without them. And of course, a special thank you and recognition of Vipanchika Bhagyanagar, the graduate student who has done unlimited amount of unpaid labor for this project. So please, everyone, if you can give Vipanchika a round of applause, we would really, really appreciate that. Thank you. Now it is my greatest of pleasures to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Rebecca Carson. Dr. Carson teaches at the Department of Critical and Historical Studies in the Royal College of Art in London. She's a theorist working in Marxism and philosophy and the author of the splendid book Imminent Okay, I can't speak this morning. Externalities, the reproduction of life in capital. She explores Marx's definition and philosophical understanding of the very category of life, which makes me very excited to hear her today on SRT and life making. Rebecca, thank you for making time and a warm welcome to our SRT lab. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I wanted to extend that thank you as well to you, Tithi, and Sue and Erin, as well as Vipachika for inviting me to be a part of this very important social reproduction theory lab that I think is really much needed. I was really excited when I saw that invitation in my inbox. And it's really an honor to be a part of this conversation. So thank you. And I am really looking forward to the discussion today. I don't have slides. I've got a presentation where I'm going to sketch out my conception of social reproduction theory by explaining key concepts that I developed in my book, Imminent Externalities. And together, these concepts aim to form a method for understanding the relationship between capital's social form and the reproduction of human life and nature, where socially reproductive labor moves between conditions of productivity and non-productivity, as well as in terms of paid and unpaid labor. And so my orientation to social reproduction is rooted in the critique of the relation between capital's abstract forms and logic and the concrete conditions of life and nature. And so this I want to argue is helpful to understand both how capitalist social form produces and reproduces the conditions of possibility for social reproduction, but also to locate where social reproduction, which is imminently and external to capitalist social form, which is why that's the title of the book, is a way that I'm situating um, social reproduction not as a distinct realm, but as a dialectical relational arena, how this imposes limits on capital's reproduction. And so by doing so, I want to show that theory is better placed to politicize sites of social reproduction for anti-capitalist aims. And so to do this in this presentation, I'm going to go through 3 stages. In the first section, I'm going to introduce what I mean by imminent externalities as a conceptual tool for understanding the relationship between capitalist accumulation and social reproduction. And to do this, I'll explain how the argument is constructed in my book, Imminent Externalities, through 3 interrelated elements. Then in a second section, I'm going to argue that adequately understanding capital's imminent externalities requires a comprehension of 2 distinct yet seldom distinguished concepts of life at work in the critique of political economy. So across Marx's work, as well as Marxists, the life of capital on the one hand and human life and nature on the other. Then thirdly, I want to consider how theorizing this ontological distinction, these 2 distinct concepts of life that I'll show also have 2 distinct reproductions, enables us to sharpen a Marxist analysis of capital's total process, and in doing so, a theory of social reproduction. So that's kind of outlining my conception of social reproduction. And then to conclude, I want to adopt this approach to social reproduction in order to address a fundamental problem facing social reproduction theory today, aging populations and corresponding shifts in class composition. And I propose that my reading of capital's total process, undertaken from this perspective of 2 dialectically contradictory reproduction, enables the integration of demographic variables into the theory of social reproduction, incorporating overlooked factors from infant care to elder care into an explicitly value theoretical argument. So these shifts in the fundamental variables of human life change the dependency ratios sustaining social reproduction as it is organized within capitalism, and therefore alter the way capitalist logic is actualized. Changes in the lives of individuals must be studied alongside the changes in the life of capital. So that's sort of the arc of the presentation. I'm going to jump into the first section where I'll explain in more detail what I mean by imminent externalities as a kind of conceptual tool or method to approach social reproduction theory. Capital famously separates social reproduction from production. In doing so, capitalist form does not logically provide for the life-making activities of its human and ecological supports. Labor power is reproduced privately and is indirectly mediated by the capitalist state. Where capitalism does provide for workers' social reproduction, this can be attributed to political contingencies, characteristically reflecting popular pressures and the hard-won gains of social movements whose achievements lack inherent stability within capitalist social relations. The instability of this provision is evident when looking to the vicissitudes of social reproduction. To name but a few factors, one could consider the advancing privatization of healthcare, the mobilization of racism as means for control of labor markets and migration, the non-linear provision of gender-affirming care and reproductive justice, and the ever-changing availability of social security nets and legal protections to uphold the subsistence of human life and nature, as well as the rise and fall of the single household income as a conduit for redistribution. Labor power's reproduction is left to the organization of non-capitalist interpersonal relations. Capitalist relations, in contrast, are impersonal relations mediated by value circulation. Interpersonal relations are determined by state and legal forms, which compel forms of labor, kinship, consumption to ensure life can be lived. These interpersonal, non-capitalist relations are central to the workings of capitalism and its conditions of reproduction and possibility. These are immanent externalities. This concept, I have argued, enables theory to grasp the non-capitalist life processes dialectically produced by and necessary for capitalist reproduction. The concept of immanent externalities reorients attention to the multiple forms of subjection at play within capital's total process, where interpersonal forms of domination operate alongside the impersonal, mute compulsion of capital's automatic subjectivity or movement towards profit. At the same time, the concept of immanent externality enables analysis to grasp the systematic determination of interpersonal forms of domination within historical development of capital's logic, where the person is a legal category distinct from its human bearer. And so that's to say that there are multiple levels of abstraction occurring here. So it's not this simple dichotomy of like human bearer, capital's abstractions. There are many other sorts of mediations going on. So the person as a legal category distinct from its human bearer renders possible new subjects, reciprocities, and dependencies that are not purely capitalist, but they're also not pre-capitalist. Such personal relations do not sit neatly outside capital's real abstractions and the impersonal domination they realize, but neither are they products of a value formalism. They're immanent and external to capital's logic. And so the argument for this reading of social reproduction is constructed through three interrelated elements that I've outlined in my book, Immanent Externalities. The first is that the capitalist mode of production as a historical formation depends on a combination of modes of subjection in order to reproduce itself. And this includes both impersonal relations of capital's fetish character and non-capitalist interpersonal relations where there are racial and gendered hierarchies used to ensure the reproduction of labor takes place. The proportion of these forms of domination evolve historically in a way that's non-linear, with the financialization of capital determining a counterintuitive return to this intensification of interpersonal forms of domination. And this is due to the financial appropriation of larger shares of surplus value through legal contracts from debt to rent. And so these interpersonal forms of domination occur because via legal contracts, profit is extracted, and that's a mediation that takes place outside of the labor process. The second is that the basis of the capitalist reproduction process is constituted by the multiple temporalities of monetary circulation, which involves the circulation of credit money and therefore future constraints on subjects. When capitalist reproduction is understood in this way, it becomes apparent that the site of a central contradiction of capitalism is displaced from the emphasis on production wage labor relations. Although these production wage labor relations are the condition the character of capitalism through the creation of surplus value, to assume this as the sole site of capitalist contradiction would beget a reductive account of the logic of capital's social relations. This is because it would not adequately address the role of social reproduction in the formation of the contradictions of capital as an immanently external process. The displaced site of contradiction within capitalist relations ought to be located in the tension between capitalist and non-capitalist elements of capital circulation. In my book, the non-capitalist elements are termed immanent externalities, as they are required for formal circulation to take place and provide the basis for capital's reproduction process, which are both produced or shaped by capital and also remain other to capital. This doesn't mean that interpersonal relations are necessarily not also impersonal ones. In circulation, capital's relations antagonistic unfolding imposes a constant redistribution of socially reproductive activity, be this through shifting demographics or through modes of financialization, and deindustrialization that might pull labor from the unproductive to the productive, from the paid to the unpaid, and vice versa. And so that is to say that sort of like activity labor that's happening as a means for social reproduction can be unpaid labor that then becomes privatized and paid, and you could be performing the very same function, but it moves between these realms. Thirdly, attention to the contradiction between capitalist and non-capitalist forms and processes internal to the reproduction of capital reveals an under-examined contradiction underpinning Capital, the book. It's 3 volumes. Within Marx's work, there are 2 conflictual concepts of life operating within capital's reproduction, one that's capitalist and the other that's non-capitalist. This tension between capital's abstract process, or the movement of value forms on the one hand, and human life and nature on the other, begets a contradiction between the possibilities of their respective reproductions. And when I was working on this, I went through all 3 volumes looking to how Marx is using the word life, and he would use life to describe the life of the value forms and the reproduction of capital, but also then life to talk about human lives and workers and labor. But it was very clear to me that he was using, like, these referred to very different concepts. So here we can grasp why capital appears to destroy I'm just going to backtrack a little bit. And so these 2 different concepts beget a contradiction between the possibility of their respective reproductions. And so here we can grasp why capital appears to destroy the biological existence of human life and nature on which it depends, owing to the fundamental contradiction between the life of capital and human life, affecting, among other things, dependency ratios and the quantity of available labor power and state policies in health and care. This contradiction reshapes and transforms capital's imminently external relations. So now I'm going to move to the second section of the presentation that's around these 2 concepts of life that I've sort of begun to introduce. Adequately understanding capital's imminent externalities requires comprehension of the 2 distinct yet seldom distinguished concepts of life at work in the critique of political economy, the life of capital on the one hand and human life and nature on the other. The first concept of life, Marx's idea of the life process of capital, is Hegelian in origin, and Hegel's concept of life and reproduction underpins the tension between capitalist interiority and exteriority in Marx. Grasping its significance helps us to better understand capital's operations, but doing so also enables us to see the difference between 2 concepts of life outlined in Capital, the book. One is used to explain the abstract life process of capital, the other concrete life of humans in metabolic relation with nature. Their differences reflects Marx's different inheritances, the philosophy of life and German idealism on the one hand, and concepts of life derived from the natural sciences, which is burgeoning at the time of Capital's writing. These 2 are distinct yet asymmetrical. Capital's abstract forms require non-capitalist forms as a means of reproduction, while non-capitalist forms can reproduce without capitalism. Capital for Marx is the free subject with its independent right. However, in Capital, the book, on a technical level, the Hegelian reconciliation of being in essence in the concept of capital as a free subject occurs only within the movement of capital's abstractions, and we don't find any reconciliation between matter and capital's form. What we find is a contradiction. And so in Capital, the book, matter, whether living or inert, cannot be ontologically understood from the point of view of Hegel's philosophy. Developed from the Hegelian dialectics of the idea, capital's life, completely fetishized to elucidate capital and its movement through value forms, excludes concrete life, which is only ever, and this capital life is only ever life-like. In Capital, the book, concrete life remains in conflict with the seemingly autonomous life of the concept subject capital, producing permanent interruptions and obstacles. This bifurcation occurs because the life process of capital is entirely fetishized and abstract, while the life of those living within capital social relations remains concrete. In the dialectically reunified category of living labor, which contains both the abstract and the concrete natural life and the life of capital exist in a permanent tension without reconciliation. Therein, the two concepts of life form an antagonism whereby concrete life is completely internal to the realm of social reproduction, or the reproduction of human life in metabolic relation to nature. Hence, for Marx, Hegel's logic primarily operates at the level of an ontology of capital or a logic of abstractions, and does not provide a basis for ontological understandings of human anthropology, matter, or the natural world. Due to natural limits, the metabolic process between humans and nature will always remain antagonistic to capital's social forms. But the concrete will also be historically altered, and therefore close attention to Marx's form analysis ought not to be used merely to grant ontological primacy to capital's abstractions, but it should be analyzed as a materialist orientation for understanding what the precise limits of capital's abstractions are and how they relate to the complexities of materials that constitute the totality of the world. What is other to capital is logically and concretely understood to retain an element in which it reproduces itself for its own sake. And this represents an ontological distinction within the logical process of reproduction that permits us to analyze the extent to which the concrete remains independent. And this, for me, this is where the politics comes in, because it then becomes possible to articulate how this independence can be retained and developed for purposes other than the reproduction of capital. And so now I'm going to move to the final section of the presentation where I elaborate a bit more on these two distinct reproductions and what they actually mean for social reproduction theory. So following this, how then does understanding capital from the perspective of reproduction, or these two reproductions, sharpen a Marxist analysis of capital's total process, and in doing so, politicize the realm of social reproduction? From these two concepts of life within capital follow two distinct reproductions within capitalist society. Dominated and shaped by the circulation of capital's value forms, concrete reproduction is limited by biosocial life processes that oblige care, rest, and nutrition, among other things. These limitations shape the circulation of capital's forms. Significantly, they negate capital's orientation to endlessly exploit its conditions of possibility, nature, matter, and human actors, including labor and socially reproductive activity. Biology, physiology, and further effective qualities comprise of life-making processes that, as concrete reproduction, are also natural limits to capital's reproduction. Pregnancy and infant care require decreased exertion of labor power, sleep is necessary, and elders become less able to work. These processes have historically specific qualities with different needs under different relations, yet they also retain a transhistorical dimension or an irreducibly extra capitalistic potential to reproduce themselves in changed conditions. Yes. Oh, sorry, I thought it was a question. Analyzing capitalist social relations from the perspective of social reproduction enables Marxism to articulate the social whole where these processes unfold. It also illuminates non-capitalist interpersonal forms of domination, racialized, gendered, ableist, colonial, imperial, ideological, and legal as parts of a unified process of circulation and reproduction in capitalism. When reading capital from the perspective of two concepts of reproduction, non-capitalist forms of domination appear central to capitalist exploitation. They're conditions of possibility for capitalist social form. And thus, foregrounding social reproduction can overcome the failings of productivist conceptions of capital, conspicuously their blindness to ableism, age, gender, and race. The critique of capital, as I have presented it, attempts to comprehend the co-production of non-capitalist forms of domination and capitalist domination as intrinsically linked within a social formation. From this, it follows that an adequate critique of the ways human life and nature are dominated by capital needs to be expanded to address the broader tension between human life and nature and capital's process of reproduction. Labor power's exploitation is not the only way individuals in capitalist society are dominated, and in fact, as Beverly Best points out in her book, The Automatic Fetish, quote, if we could graph the irreducible variety of forms of life making on a pie chart, only a very thin wedge of that chart would constitute the activity that capital is able to turn into productive labor. That is, that capital is able to harness for the production of value, unquote. So interpersonal forms of domination, they redistribute value away from individuals through structurally mediating life-making activity within capital's reproduction. While shorn of the dynamism of capitalist production, these are nevertheless dominative and immiserating relations unfolding within the circulation process, be it through movements of merchant capital or the extraction of rents and debt. When social reproduction theory considers social reproduction merely as the mechanism that reproduces labor power and not as a fundamental force underpinning capital's capacity to reproduce itself systematically, it fails to grasp what's at stake in the social reproduction of those excluded from the waged labor. In practice, those removed from waged labor are necessary to actualize the circulation of capital's abstractions, whether we mean a reserve army of labor, consumers, or those performing the unpaid domestic labor that reproduces labor power. What's more, the precise role of finance and rentierism and ecology in capital's reproduction become harder to parse when we have an overemphasis on the wage laborer's reproduction. And so this method of reading Capital, the book, where we find to reproduction, expands the scope of reproduction theory. It's not looking explicitly for the socio-material roots of gender-based oppression in capital, as Lise Vogel did, but for the socio-material form of a complex array of interpersonal forms of domination that sustain the reproduction of capital's social relations. Reading Capital in this way enables us to not only locate how gender-based domination works in capitalism, more broadly, it permits us to understand social reproduction as the structural relation of the reproduction of human life and nature for capital. And so in keeping with the theme of the series, gender theory is for everybody, this is an argument that SRT is the necessary method for the critique of capital in its present formation, as this method implicates a vast array of relations that might not appear within a more narrowly production-centric account of capital. And so rectified, Marxism is better able to confront ecological degradation, rentierism, imperialism, racism, and colonialism, all of which structurally determine the demographic and class-based formation of social reproduction and the ways that social reproduction sustains the daily and intergenerational renewal of life in capitalism. And so now I'm going to move to the conclusion where I kind of want to quickly, briefly, and kind of point to how this is being used in something I'm currently working on. And so to conclude, I want to point to the advantages of applying this method of SRT to thinking about changes in dependency ratios occurring in aging societies, intimating how this methodological orientation could be used by briefly pointing to a new project I'm working on. The contradiction between the reproduction of human life and the reproduction of capital's abstract form engenders periodic outbreaks of widespread difficulty or crisis in care, when dependency ratios shift, or when populations are excluded from necessary life-making resources, such as housing and healthcare. This occurs because capitalist form makes no inherent provision for stable social reproduction. Indeed, in its relentless motion, it systematically undermines it. Prioritizing social reproduction is structurally incompatible with capital's drive for accumulation. The role of capitalist states at a higher level of concretion has been to manipulate the family form with its embedded racial and gender dimensions through a normative distribution of welfare, social security, and forms of wage distribution that ensure unpaid and low-paid socially reproductive labor can be exploited to absorb the shortcomings of capital's abstraction from unpaid toil. Aging populations and declining fertility rates complexify the capitalist state's task here, but they also change variables affecting the self-assertion of capital's inherent tendencies. The critical question is one of how social reproduction will respond to these changes and how the imminently external relations of social reproduction in turn exert new pressures on the actions taken by major actors within capital's circulation. This, I think, is a pressing challenge for social reproduction theory. Any adequate response will have to grapple with the complex transformations of profit-driven activity and household labor. In the context of aging populations, significant job growth will tend to occur in the service sector or care work, especially in low wage personal services where we find class composition to be racialized and gendered, as pointed out by Gabriel Winant in his book, The Next Shift. These jobs are difficult to mechanize and hence capitalistically rely on absolute surplus value or more labor. And so they're hard to outsource, especially when immigration policy is politically suppressed. And they need to take place locally. Because of this, productivity gains are hard to come by as accumulating surplus value requires more employees and is therefore susceptible to these very limits of demographic change. What then does this mean for capital's total social process? How will capitalist and non-capitalist relations change as such developments entrench? Examining what demography means for capitalism through the lens of capital's imminent externalities enables us to see that what is often described as a demographic time bomb or crisis reflects a deeper antagonism between the life of capital and human life and nature. The social miseries produced by demographic shifts, be that in a historic youth bulge where maintenance of infants, children, and youth are around depleted resources, and a large number incur difficulty in entering labor markets, or in an aging population where the maintenance of elders requires support from a shrinking number of workers and overwhelms kinship structures and existing healthcare infrastructure, as well as placing stress on social welfare systems and pensions. All are expressions of the contradiction between these two forms of life. The vampire-like reproduction of capital, whose structure is homologous to the Hegelian dialectic on the one hand, and finite natural life on the other, which is not a moment internal to the dialectic of capital, but sits outside it as the disavowed material support for the self-expansion of capital's ideal forms. People die and capital doesn't. The rate at which populations expand and contract transforms the assertion of capital's inherent tendencies. And so then what I wanted to say is that in light of this sort of position, this sort of application to thinking about demography, the task that confronts SRT today is to explore the complex ways concrete societies will mutate as a result of these transformations. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm going to open the floor up for questions, but we must give Rebecca time to respond to them. So we will stop around, when there's 5 minutes left, so that Rebecca can respond. Let's take 3 questions to begin with and see how we go from there. I just want everybody to know that we are facing a rather crisis moment in the US right now. So I would really, really request that people keep their comments to the presentation and avoid sort of any kind of the digression, because we've had certain people infiltrate meetings on gender and race and colonialism, and as a result of which speakers and organizers have been targeted by their employers in the public media and so on. So please, everybody, I really, really request that you keep those comments to this really sizzling presentation. I will start, Rebecca, by asking you your title in the book, Imminent Externalities, is itself a theoretical and political provocation, which I find extremely generative for not just SRT, but for all of us to engage with. So my question is very simple. You argue throughout the book and in this brilliant presentation that social reproduction is external to the social form of capital. I would like you to explain or talk a bit more by what you mean by external. You've used other, you've said external. And you've said privately produce labor power, but some of us argue that labor power is not just produced privately, it is shaped in the public sphere as well. So, and as we know, some certain kinds of social reproductive labor produces value. Certain kinds don't, and certain kinds do. So I would like your thoughts on that as to what exactly do you mean when you say social reproduction is external to the social form of capital. I love the argument that there are 2 lives here that we must reckon with, which, I fully agree. I just want you to maybe talk a little bit more. But that's my question. And let's have a few more from the audience. You can either put your question in the chat or you can speak, in which case just unmute yourself. Go ahead, Erin.
I think I might be asking a question that's similar to Titi's, but from a slightly different perspective. And it has to do with what we might mean, what you might mean, what we should mean with concrete in the concrete life. Um, on on some accounts, what makes life concrete would be it being a concatenation of the diverse. That's a kind of unity of the diverse. One element of which would include the way that it is in part abstract. And so I'm having trouble with the imminent externality. It's super provocative and it's a really cool synthesis and it's exhilarating to think along with. But if in my conception, part of what makes concrete life concrete is also that it's rendered in part abstract, I'm having trouble hanging the imminent and the external together in as elegant a way as you described.
these are very fundamental questions, so we must give Rebecca time to answer. Is there one more person that would like to pose a question?
So I was thinking too, it might be nice to answer those questions together because of their overlapping
Go
concerns.
for it then.
But
Yes,
yeah,
yeah,
great. Thank you.
absolutely.
Yeah, because I think those are such important questions because they get to the absolute core of the argument and also like the stickiness of it. But starting from the like origin of the concept of imminent externalities, I think it's interesting to say a little bit about of what where or important to say a little bit about where I got it from. It didn't come directly from this, but in Suzanne de Bruynhof's book Marx on Money, she sort of does this sort of like reading where she traces Marx's Capital from the perspective of money, and it's actually quite a short book, but it's sort of this logic of the role of money across Marx's three volumes of Capital. And there she refers to money as being both immanent and external because she's trying to understand the role of money as a medium of circulation. In like the special role of money as a medium of circulation, it's also a medium of reproduction. And that sort of got me to think about the sort of dialectical role of things that are necessary for capital's reproduction, but also are in a trans-historical way, not necessarily capitalist. And money is a very interesting value form for that. And it's kind of, what she wants to say is that because money is the only value form, so if we're thinking about value form in Marx, we mean money, commodity, capital. And so the movement of value between these forms. Money is a special form because it's the medium of reproduction of capital. And what she wants to say is that has to be both capitalist and not capitalist in order to reproduce capital, because it otherwise you get a kind of logical contradiction that doesn't enable circulation to happen. So value appears as money, but it has this indirect relation. It can't be money and value aren't the same thing. So it always has to retain this kind of independence. And so that got me thinking about the role, the other reproduction in Marx and that logical role of social reproduction. Um, and so it's a very dialectical concept where it is capitalist and imminent externalities are absolutely capitalist and they're not at the same time. And this double ontology helps us to think about that a bit better because the commodity form is both abstract and concrete. The concrete, this is to answer Erin's question. I would understand the concrete as having it's um, it's also capitalist in the sense that it's a negative ontology. It's a relational to the abstract. But in that negativity, the concrete is also transhistorical. And so all of the stuff of life that exists within capital that makes up this materiality also can exist in other social forms and has done in the past. And so they'll be performing both things at the same time. Um, and so to answer Tithi's question around labor power a bit more directly, I think labor power is this very thing that it's it is produced by capital and also that unpaid labor can be moved between being paid and unpaid, or productive labor can be productive in some instances or some relations and unproductive in other relations, and it's the very same labor. And in either case, when we're performing reproductive labor that is paid, it still retains this element of it reproducing the materiality that's at the same time conditioned by capital's abstractions. And so when you're working in a care home and looking after an elder and helping them to eat and think and engage, uh, if you're doing that in the context of a home, it's still the same job and it still, in a sense, retains that element of being about reproducing life, whether or not you're constricted by other forms of domination at the same time. And so there's this kind of layering of things. Uh, Maybe I'll stop there. I hope that answers both of your questions.
It's a great way to start a conversation. We need more of these. Thank you, Rebecca. We have a question here in the comments from Tu Nguyen. Thanks so much, Rebecca, for the presentation. I wonder how SRT would locate and examine sexuality and desire in digitally mediated capitalism, especially considering the two forms of life that are reproduced in tension, capital's life and human nature life. Just before Rebecca comes on, I speak this to the whole audience. There is a marvelous book that we have just produced in our series, Social Reproduction Theory, that is out from Pluto Press by Alan Sears. And that is really, really in a fantastic sort of, not an answer to the question, but at least one of the answers to your question. Back to Rebecca.
Yes, thank you. Because I also don't look at sexuality directly, and I think in the way that I'm working, I kind of position it under the category of gender because of the gender dynamics and underpinning it. But I do also understand that these are also like discrete methods of analysis. And to echo Tithi, I really, really appreciate Sean's work and can't recommend it more. Yeah, the way that I think about that is I think that you get kind of contradictions in when you're existing in the context of this digital realm where you get like highly commodified, capitalistically mediated forms in which you might be able to engage in very affirming, explorative practices of life, reproduction of life and possibilities. And so what I hope you don't think that this is too much of a cop out, but what I think is that 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 those spaces are contradictory, and we get a lot of like quite empowering politicized dynamics happening within this context. But I also think when we're living in capitalist societies, we're always existing within these contradictions, that there aren't really free spaces. And so I think that the specificity of this sort of like digital ways of like presenting and inhabiting sexualities and pluralities offers this sort of exceptional space to have life affirming experiences and relationships within the context of something that is very much capitalistically dominating through its sort of formal structures and the way in which the digital world is implicated in the reproduction of profit.
Thank you, Rebecca. The floor is open for more questions. You can unmute yourself and ask a question if you need to. While you're thinking, I would really urge you to look at the poster for this series so that you don't miss the next sessions. We have Amy. Go ahead.
Hi everyone. Hi Rebecca. Thank you so much for that.
Hey, Amy. So nice to see you online again.
Yeah, hi from Boston now. I loved your talk. I loved hearing about the book again, which I've read, and you brought out you clarified a lot of things for me there in the talk as well. I feel like I have a firmer grasp of the intervention you're making there. I wondered if you could talk. You're a great reader of Hegel, Rebecca, and I wondered if you might talk a bit more about the concept of social form and the dialectic of content and form that Marx kind of gets from Hegel here in this context. So I'm thinking of how that comes up in your work in the divide you draw, let's say, between how capital acts as if it were independent and not dependent on social reproduction. And then on the other hand, how, for example, it sheds labor in a very concrete way, deals with its own contradictions that way. And I think the work you're doing is so important for clarifying that dynamic, that movement. And so the second part of this question, so one is, could you tell us a bit more about how Hegel informs your thinking there? And then secondly, what do you think about what this means, or how it might help us think about things like embodiment, what's real and not real, and transmoral panics, for example, processes of racialization? I think there's something really important and helpful there in the method you're laying out for us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that question, Amy. And yeah, because I pointed to, and I did go into a little bit, but that question of like, how does Hegel inform this thinking is important because it is very much centrically underpinning the sort of way in which I'm thinking about and talking about almost all of it. And especially, I think it kind of goes back to the first question that I answered around the concept of imminent externalities, because this concept is derived from Suzanne de Bronhoff's observation of the way in which money worked as a particular kind of value form within capital. And for me, that made me think, within the context of social reproduction theory, we've thought a lot about how labor is a special commodity form because it's not produced by capital. It's produced by something that's non-capitalist. But it made me think that if we're reading, I was intentionally reading from the the 3 volumes of Capital from the perspective of reproduction. And that gets back, that's because of my reading of Capital with the Hegelian insight, which I'll get to in a second, made me think that the money form as a medium of reproduction was also a special kind of commodity that could tell us quite a lot about reading Capital. And this is because Hegel, and thinking about like reading Capital from the perspective of being quite informed and reading it in and through the science of logic, thinking that the way that Marx constructed the value forms is, in a way, I wouldn't say go as far as to what we get in value theory. There's a lot of these sort of direct mappings, which I didn't get into, but conceptually, very much an application of the science of logic. You find that Hegel goes from life to reproduction. Of course, in Hegel's dialectics, what comes later retrospectively determines the former. And so when we're looking at life and capital and reproduction and what the role that life is doing in terms of whether we mean labor, populations, people, nature, or this sort of abstract vampire-like life of capital. In order to understand it retrospectively, we have to understand reproduction. And so that emphasis on reproduction in my reading of the 3 volumes of Capital 100% came from Hegel's logic of where reproduction sits in that analysis. And that led me to also like thinking about money in that particular way as being a kind of special kind of commodity. And so that sort of getting to the second part of your question around what that means for embodiment and the sort of moral panic around trans feminism and racialization as well. I think that the way in which that in Marx's analysis, those abstractions are always come into social being via the material, which is why you have the commodity form of the abstract and the concrete. And so they kind of don't exist except for the way in which they're weighing on, dominating, immiserating the material. And when we get sort of the historical specificity of navigating the way in which race, gender, sexuality plays a necessary role in the reproduction of these abstractions, these sorts of dominations hang heavy on wanting to reproduce a sort of status quo of a social conservatism in which capitalism emerged. And so is that it comes back to that question of like, is racism necessary for capitalism? Is it not logically necessary? It's like it is necessary because it was historically necessary, and that's how the logic of capital unfolded in relation to its into in relation to into its concrete. And so we have nothing other than that. And so whether it could logically exist without it or not, it has to it is the case that like capitalism can exist with a more sort of like liberal social world or less liberal social world. These sorts of push and pull do happen, but it's never stable. And so I think these these abstractions weigh heavy on reproducing a social conservatism because of a historical relationship to reproducing the status, the conditions of possibility that have historically enabled capitalism to reproduce itself.
Thank you, Rebecca. And unfortunately, that's all we have time for right now. I want to make a few announcements. Please log or zoom in for our next speaker, which is going to be Sarah Ferris on September 24th, same time at 12 noon US East Coast time. Sarah's book, In the Name of Women's Rights, The Rise of Female Nationalism, is something you can look up as well. And if you have any books that you have read recently on social reproduction theory or anything close to feminist activism based off of social reproduction theory, please let us know so we can publicize it in our series. And we would also like to publicize events that you might be hosting, which is related to SRT. But for now, goodbye. But first, let's give a round of applause and thank you for our speaker, Rebecca Carson.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.